Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the beta for Tom Clancy's The Division. This is developed by Ubisoft Massive, or Massive Entertainment if you prefer. They're most well known, I think, for World and Conflict, so they're most well known for strategy games, but here they are bringing us this third-person cover-based shooter with some very, very light RPG elements that they keep trying to pass it off as an actual RPG. It certainly is not an RPG, and whenever you hear people saying, "Oh, but it's an RPG," they are missing the point entirely. The only RPG elements this thing has are stats and loot. It doesn't even really have any role-playing in the skills department because you can just actually get every skill that you want whenever you want it, really, as long as you have the prerequisites unlocked. But I'll get to that in a moment. The full game is going to release on March 8th of this year, and it is, of course, coming to PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version running on max settings. And this might look kind of odd to you because you're probably seeing a pretty significant amount of frame rate hitching. I would like to remind you that I am running this on an i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 970. That's actually above the recommended specs, and it actually cannot maintain 60 FPS. In fact, more often than not, it's somewhere fluctuating wildly between 30 FPS and 45 to 50 FPS. And strangely enough, I actually can't figure out why. I've seen people with weaker systems than mine get better performance on higher settings, while I've seen people with better systems than mine get worse performance than I do, and it just doesn't make any sense. Now, the one thing I have seen across the board is that it generally runs like crap on AMD cards because they optimized it for NVIDIA and put in a bunch of NVIDIA-specific effects that just completely tank performance on an AMD card. If you disable those NVIDIA-specific effects, you do get a pretty significant performance boost on AMD cards, but oddly enough, they don't see much of a performance increase on NVIDIA cards, even though they're supposed to be very heavily taxing. So the only conclusion I can really draw from this is that even with the updated NVIDIA drivers that I've got, this thing's just blatantly unoptimized. And I get that it's a beta and that not every bit of optimization has been worked out yet, but when performance is this weak on hardware this powerful and the game doesn't even look that great, there's something horribly wrong. I mean, that's not to say that the game looks bad. It doesn't. It actually looks pretty good. It's just that it doesn't really look like anything out of the norm for current console games. And it's pretty obvious that this thing has seen a pretty significant graphics downgrade since what they showed us at E3, which unfortunately seems to be the norm these days, but let's put it this way. If it hadn't been visually downgraded and it hadn't been this obvious, then I would have actually been able to put aside the fact that this thing doesn't run very well. It would have been more of a, oh, this is cutting edge, it's certainly not going to run the best on my hardware because I don't have the best hardware out there. But with the way it looks now, where they did put quite a lot of detail into things, and particularly the animations. The animations in this game are actually pretty fantastic, believe it or not. It's down to even the small touches, like the incredibly fantastic trigger discipline that your character has. And that's something that most people wouldn't even notice. The fact that your character never has their finger on the trigger unless they are actually pointing their weapon at something. And when you combine that with the amount of detail they packed into the characters' outfits, the fact that there's so little clipping on their outfits, the less noticeable things like trash just kind of drifting along, like newspapers, for example, just kind of floating along, or the snow coming down, all these different things just blend together to create some absolutely superb art direction. So while the visual quality itself is fairly good, and you do have some pretty decent res textures, you got very nice modeling for the most part, there are a few jagged edges here and there, and it does have reasonably solid lighting effects, what ultimately elevates it is just how much attention to detail the developers put into it, and they should definitely be applauded for that. But come on, guys, you need to fix the performance. This game does not run well, and particularly when you get into the player versus player stuff, that becomes a pretty significant problem. So that's really the biggest thing they need to fix. All the various other bugs that this game has can take a back seat to that, really. And speaking of taking a back seat, the sound design is just kinda eh. You do have some decent gunfire sounds, you do have some decent voice acting, and you do have some decent ambient sounds, but the music is frankly entirely forgettable, And the voice acting, while decent, ultimately ends up being just completely forgettable as well. You don't really give a crap about any of the characters because they don't really have much in the way of character, at least not in this particular beta, because this is a very small slice of the game, so you're not really given much opportunity to bond with anything. So mostly you're hearing a bunch of battle chatter, and occasionally that gets kinda goofy. For example, if we fight tactically, we'll be able to beat them. I couldn't help but crack up when the guy said that, because his AI squad mates were all just hunkering down in the same spot, not really actually being tactical, so it was just absurd. But overall, the sound design, what we get of it anyway in this particular beta, is generally pretty solid, so it's not that big of a deal. But what is a big deal is the story and the gameplay, although there's really not much in the way of story in this because you're only given access to 2 missions, and really they don't do that much to enlighten you as to what the actual plot of the game is, or what's going on, who you are, why you're doing what you're doing, etc. And so I'm not really going to focus on that so much as I'm going to focus on how the actual game compares to the scenarios that they have set up. So the beta starts with your character being dropped into post-pandemic New York City, and you're told that your objective is basically to restore order to the city, after which you are given a mission to go and establish basically a forward operations base. And once you have done that, you are given access to new missions, new side ops, that you can go on to upgrade various things for your base, as well as get access to new loot, get more experience points, level up, that sort of thing. And as far as the beta goes, there are only 2 actual story missions in this game. The first of them is establishing the forward operations base. The second one is rescuing someone so you can actually set up the medical part of the base. Every other bit of the base is completely non-functional. They do not have crafting in here. They do not have the other wings of the base other than medical, and medical only has access to 2 of the upgrades. You upgrade various things throughout these wings of the base by collecting materials that are appropriate to them. For example, with the medical wing, you're going to be collecting medical supplies, and once you have enough of those, you can upgrade the medical wing with various bits and bobs, like a clinic or a quarantine area and things like that. And this will give you access to additional abilities beyond the 3 that you can start off with. The first of these is just a basic vision pulse, where you press the button and it sends out a pulse, and any enemy within the pulse's radius ends up being highlighted and marked, and you get bonuses, which can actually change depending on how you modify the ability. Once you have unlocked the second thing for the medical wing, which is the quarantine area, you can actually upgrade your pulse ability with various additional modifications that will give you different bonuses, like cloaking your party instead of simply sending out a vision pulse, or applying a debuff to the enemies instead of simply sending out a vision pulse. Things like that, but you can only have one mod equipped at a time as far as we can tell. The other 3 powers are a basic landmine kind of thing, which I never really used, as well as a ballistic shield that I never used. And then you unlock through upgrading the medical facility an additional power that will allow you to actually launch a healing area of effect ability. And that's all we have access to in the beta, but from what I saw of the abilities tree, your customization options are very, very limited. There's no real class system in this game, so you just kind of pick and choose whatever abilities you want. You can only have 2 of them at a time, as far as I can tell. You may be able to unlock additional slots later, but from what I can tell, there's only 2 available slots, which are bound to the Q and E buttons on the keyboard. And they're basic cooldown abilities. You trigger the ability, and then it goes on a cooldown timer, and once it's finished the cooldown timer, you can use it again. You have infinite uses of that. So it's rather straightforward, and the way the beta worked out, the healing power was one that pretty much everybody had to have. And nobody I saw using the ballistic shield, and I didn't see anybody using the mines either. It was basically just vision pulse and the healing ability, because the other 2 abilities really weren't that great. You didn't even really need them. I mean, this is a third-person cover-based shooter with really dumb AI. Generally speaking, you can just mow enemies down before they become even remotely a problem, and the only real challenge you're ever going to get is if you turn it up to hard mode, in which case the enemies become ridiculously bullet spongy, and they do a lot of damage when they hit you, and that's pretty much it. Otherwise, they don't really pose much of a threat at all, and it's not really until you get to the Dark Zone that you're going to run into really big problems. Now, speaking of bullet sponge enemies and their really poor AI, Ubisoft is trying to pass this thing off as a role-playing game. It's really not. It's a third-person shooter with some very, very light RPG elements. Think of it as something more akin to Destiny or Borderlands, which are both blatantly first-person shooters with some very light RPG elements, and the only real significance to that is the stat systems that crop up with regards to weapons and other equipment. Same basic principle applies here, but it's a third-person cover-based shooter instead of a Halo-esque first-person shooter, or whatever Borderlands is supposed to be. But anyway, point being, enemies have levels, and you have a level, and all the weapons have levels, and they all have stats, and each of these stats does different things. To give you an example, marksman rifles, which is kind of the catch-all category for both designated marksman rifles like the Scar H, as well as actual sniper rifles like a Mosin Nagant or things like that, are given a significant bonus to headshot damage, while other things are given bonuses to damage at certain health levels or things like that. Generally speaking, the bonuses that you're going to find with these various weapons are very, very boring. They're just static damage bonuses, or they're critical chance bonuses of some description. They're not really anything like what you saw in, say, Borderlands, where you would find this weird gun that happened to shoot waves, or you found a shotgun that fired mini grenades, or something crazy like that. This is all real-world equipment, so you're running around with things like M4s, AK-47s, etc., and it's really, really hard to suspend your disbelief when completely unarmored thugs are taking multiple 7.62s to the face and are perfectly fine. And frankly, my disbelief was completely shattered when I went into a specific encounter, which there are these various encounters scattered throughout the map. They're basically just wave-based enemies or something of that nature. And I ran across a group of JTF soldiers who were under fire and needed assistance, and they were like, "We can't hold out much longer." And then I get there, and they're all decked out in armor, they've got fully automatic assault rifles, and they're fighting a group of completely unarmored thugs who were armed with baseball bats and handguns. That straight up doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And it's things like that scattered throughout the game that made it just really hard to get immersed in the setting, even though there was so much attention to detail in said setting. I mean, they throw in these things called echoes, where you go up to a specific point, it says, "Oh, there's an echo detected," and then you activate it, and it gives you this kind of holographic display of a past event, and gives you an audio recording of it. And in some cases, you can actually investigate those, and that's kind of cool, but that gives you some insight into the backstory of this particular area. You get some idea of what you're really fighting for, and yet all of that is just whisked away when you actually get to the core gameplay mechanics, which are incredibly gamey. That's the problem when you try to interject RPG elements into a shooter. It becomes so gamey that it's almost impossible to suspend your disbelief. And that is why, generally speaking, you don't really see a lot of modern-day or real-world setting first-person shooters or third-person shooters that have RPG elements in them, sort of like what this does. It works okay in a sci-fi context because you can justify with, oh, weird space weapons and space armor and things like that. You can't justify it when it's just some guy in a hoodie taking 7.62s to the face. It doesn't make any sense. But even putting that aside, the actual gameplay mechanics themselves are just boring. It's a plain old cover-based third-person shooter with some stats thrown in. So all of the enemies are bullet sponges, and you're dealing with a pretty bare-bones combat system. It works, it's smooth, but it gets really tedious, especially considering that we have played so many cover-based shooters at this point. And the rather weak abilities that you get in the beta, at least, don't really do anything to help that. Instead of thinking things through from a more tactical standpoint, you end up just kind of hunkering down behind the cover, and when enemies rush towards you, you mow them down with your fully automatic weapon, and then you switch over to your other weapon that might not be fully automatic but is better for long range, and you pick off a few guys at long range. You rinse and repeat until you get bored of it. And it should be noted that this game isn't exactly difficult. In fact, it's fairly easy unless you switch it over to hard mode or you go into the dark zone. Because when you switch it over to hard mode and you turn it to the dark zone, the enemies become ridiculously bullet spongy and they do large amounts of damage, but they don't really get any smarter. And when you try to play this thing solo, it just ends up being incredibly boring. When you go into co-op mode is where things get a bit more interesting, purely by nature of being able to play it with your friends, but there's also the matter of taking your co-op team and going into the dark zone. Now, you can go into the dark zone by yourself if you want. It's a terrible idea, but you can do it. And to give you a general idea, the dark zone is basically like if you have played RuneScape. I know this is drifting way back, but if you've played RuneScape and you've gone into the wilderness, that's basically what the dark zone is. You go into this area and now you can actually do PvP. You can't hurt members of your own squad, but what you can do is just hurt anybody else, and if you hurt somebody, then you immediately turn into a rogue agent. This gives you a plainly identifiable skull mark and allows the other players to just attack you without any repercussions whatsoever. So they can just mow you down, take all of your loot, and run off and do their own merry thing. Now the thing is, anybody can go rogue at any point, and while there is opportunity for you to go into the dark zone with your co-op squad, take down a bunch of powerful NPCs and take their loot, and then go to an extraction point so you can actually take that loot back and put it into your stash. The idea being that the loot is infected, and thus you need to extract it and it needs to be cleaned before it can be placed into your inventory. But there's always someone who's going to throw a monkey wrench into that. And if you go in there solo or with a non-full party, or even with a full party, you can actually run into other people and work together with them if you want, or work against them if you want. You can backstab people up the wazoo, and it creates this really kind of paranoid environment. The problem being, it's kind of a complete cluster. When we went into the dark zone, it just ended up being this complete mess where one or two guys had gone rogue, and we got caught in the crossfire, and it just ended up being this complete mess of everybody shooting everybody else, and eventually we managed to get out of the area, only to constantly be backstabbed and things like that. Eventually we did manage to get some loot out of that, but it was just a complete mess. There was no real sense of cohesion, there was no real sense of working together and working against each other. It was just an insane free-for-all. And after a while, we started getting pissed off at it. And that's partly due to the other players, but also due to the fact that when you die in the dark zone, you lose some experience points. Now, dark zone experience is different from your actual level from the single player and the PvE co-op. You have two different levels. You have your basic level, which is what you have in the PvE and the single player and all that sort of thing. As you level up, you will gain access to new equipment. Same thing kind of applies in the dark zone, except that it uses a different currency and it uses a different experience point system. You have your dark zone level, your DZ level. And as you earn experience in the dark zone, that level will increase, and that will allow you to equip better and better dark zone gear. And the thing is that all the good stuff is in the dark zone, not in the single player and PvE. So it's something of a double-edged sword, and I feel like it's actually going to alienate a lot of people who really aren't looking to have all their stuff taken away from them when they want to just get some decent loot. Because when you're getting some loot in the single player and the PvE, generally speaking, it's absolutely pathetic. I mean, it took me a very, very long time to replace the starting M4 that you get in the beta. When you create a new character in this beta, you start with an M9 pistol, an MP5 submachine gun, and an M4 assault rifle. I found substitutes for the M9 and the MP5 pretty rapidly, in fact, but I never found something that was better than the M4 until I was level 7. The level cap in the beta is at level 8. Now granted, you start at level 4, but even then, it was kind of ridiculous just how little loot was actually really useful. And none of it was particularly interesting. So what? You found an M249, you found another M4, you found a double-barreled shotgun. Okay, that's mildly cool, I guess, but where's the really interesting stuff? The unique weapons that just scream out something crazy? They don't seem to be there, at least they aren't in the beta. And the best stuff that I could find in the beta was of the blue tier. There's 2 tiers higher than that. And while you do get the option to modify your weapons with the various attachments that you can find throughout the world that'll give you different stat bonuses, it just wears thin really quickly. So while there are a few things here and there that are kind of interesting, the overwhelming feeling I got from the beta was a resounding meh. Once you get past the setting and the attention to detail, what you find is a rather standard cover-based shooter that ultimately becomes substandard because of the emphasis on stat-based equipment that all ends up being incredibly boring and thus leads the combat to just drag on and on and on, mixed in with a very chaotic PvP experience. And from what I can tell from the story missions that they did include in this, not really much in the way of story that will actually keep you interested. The game ultimately just doesn't inspire confidence. Sure, it'll be better if they manage to sort out the performance problems this thing has and actually make it a consistently performing game as opposed to the wildly inconsistent performance that we get right now. And sure, it'll be a bit more interesting when all of the mechanics are unlocked instead of having only a handful of them available in the beta, but I can't really see this thing having too much lasting appeal. Even playing co-op, we got tired of it pretty quickly, and I think that speaks volumes. Ultimately, thanks to this beta, I've decided that I am not going to pick this thing up until it goes on a really deep discount. I just don't think it's worth it. It's not the kind of game that I'm really into. I really don't like loot-based games. They rely far too much on addiction factor rather than compelling gameplay, and that really does show here. And even then, this is a loot-based game with loot that isn't very interesting. Right there, they have failed their mandate. And in the long run, I really just can't see this thing having too much longevity. But hey, at least when I do eventually pick this thing up, I'll already know it's a disappointment just from having played this beta and found out that it is indeed a disappointment. Thanks for watching.